Hi and welcome back. If you've already completed lessons 1 and 2 of this 5-part video series about the session initiation protocol and you're ready for part 3, then you're in the right place. Now that we've finally finished analysing our first call, it only took 2 hours, we'll set up some more peer-to-peer SIP calls and through them learn about how we can further manipulate SIP and SIP messages. We'll look at more SIP requests, more SIP headers, more SIP call flow and more SIP processes. But before we get started, it's probably worth reminding ourselves about the key points we covered in the last lesson. We started off by downloading a couple of SIP user agents and using them to set up our first SIP call. In that first call, we looked at the flow of SIP signaling messages in the basic call. The invite to begin with, the request that begins or initiates the session. It's the one that effectively attracts the attention of the other guy and invites him to talk. We saw how the invite was answered by a provisional response, the 100 trying, followed closely by the 180 ringing, reporting back to the upstream user agent client that the downstream phone is now ringing. We saw how a 200 OK response was sent back upstream when the downstream user agent picked up the phone and agreed to take the call. We looked in great detail at the ACK and how it seems to keep on breaking the rules. A transaction in its own right, no incrementing CSeq value, more of a response in nature than a request. The list goes on. We also looked at the buy request used to end the call, and we touched on the cancel request and how SIP, being a very polite protocol, gets user agents to send a cancel downstream if no responses have been received to any of its 7 transmitted invites during that 32-second period. We put responses into both families and categories. We said that any response beginning with a 1 something something is a provisional response to report progress but not to conclude anything. And we agreed that anything beginning with a 2 something something is a success response. Now, although we didn't look at any other families of responses, we noted that anything 200 or above is categorized as being a final response, a response that completes a transaction. We'll look at other non-success response types in this lesson. We discussed the important difference between initial requests, being any request that begins or initiates a SIP session, and subsequent requests, being any other request within a SIP session that follows that initial request. We talked about SIP transactions. Remember the small self-contained exchanges between SIP devices? The transaction begins with a request and almost always finishes with a final response, including any provisional responses that may in between. The exception to that rule, of course, was the ACK, the self-contained transaction. We delved further into the topic of media options, specifically at how codec information is carried downstream in the payload of the invite and back upstream in the payload of the 200 OK. Both sets of media options provide a list of codecs that each user agent is willing to use for the call, plus address information so the other guy can send media packets to the right place. We talked about how there's no real negotiation of media options, but instead of how SIP just offers a simple process in which, where there's a choice of codecs, both user agents simply know, without any backwards and forwards interaction, to use the first codec common to both lists. We looked more at the content or headers of SIP messages. Remember how we should read the to and the from headers, even in a response, as being those constant references to who the request was originally intended to and who it was from? Remember that even in the response, the to and the from are not swapped over. They remain that constant reference. It's through the contact header that a user agent client provides his address where he's contactable during the session, just in case the guy on the other side wants to send him a subsequent request during this call. It usually contains an IP address. The via header also usually contains an IP address for routing purposes, but not for routing subsequent requests like the contact address. This time it's for routing responses. In other words, a user agent client puts his address in the via header so the other guy knows where to route back responses to him. Now, although both the contact header and the via header contain routing addresses, remember to never get them mixed up. It's the contact header for routing subsequent requests and the via header which is used for routing responses. The content type and the content length headers, they're just there to give clues to the user agent regarding which parser to use to pass or to read the payload. In most invite requests, the content type will be application SDP, and the content length will just be the number of characters in the SDP session description. we looked for the first time at the CSeq header and saw how it had a method type and a numerical value. And we saw how the method type reflected the transaction to which the message belongs. Some say that the CSeq header is a transaction identifier, although there's much more that we'll need to discuss about a transaction and how to identify them. Although we've touched on the fact that the numerical value may increment between transactions, we haven't yet determined why or when it will change, or why and when it will stay the same. That's one of those things that you're going to be looking at for in this lesson. We talked more about reliable delivery, specifically of the final response to the invite through our old friend the ACK. And we talked of reliable delivery for subsequent requests, such as the buy, through plain old final responses like the 200 OK. Remember, the user agents don't actually care what type of response comes back, they just care about getting a response back. So where the expected round trip time is estimated to take half a second or less, a final response can be sent back directly, so they don't need to have a 100 trying anymore. So what do the 100 trying and the ACK have in common? They both report reliable delivery. And finally, mixed in amongst all the topics we discussed in last lesson was the routing of the ACK and the buy, and how both being subsequent requests, a user agent takes the contact address from the other guy, the address it stored in its route set earlier, and inserts it into the request URI of the outgoing subsequent request before sending that request out over the network to the other guy. In this lesson we'll set up some more peer-to-peer SIP calls, and through them we'll focus not just on simple call setup, but on more complex issues such as how SIP enables us to change the nature of our call mid-session, maybe to add video to our audio or to change to a different quality codec without having to hang up and make a new call. We'll be looking at re-invites. We'll be looking at some new SIP headers, including the important call ID header, as well as allow, accept, and support headers. We'll take a look at how we can change our minds about or give up on inviting someone to a call, another use of the cancel request. Then we'll see how we can, if we want to, seek for other user agents' capabilities before we formally invite them. And then we'll look at some more SIP response types, including those for non-success scenarios where the call doesn't get set up, perhaps because the guy is busy or just plain doesn't want to talk to the caller. I'm kind of itching to get onto SIP servers and server-based services. That's coming up in the next lesson though, so I'll just have to be patient a little bit longer. Just a couple of quick reminders before we get started. One of your tasks is to keep a list of all the requests and responses you encounter. And the other thing was to consider the CSeq number and to look for a rule or a reason about why and when it should increment. Right then, let's get started with some practical. In a moment I'm going to ask you to load up your two user agents again and set up another peer-to-peer call. First though, how about you do a bit of thinking and hypothesize about something? You may have noticed that the user agent has a hold button. Now we all know what putting someone on hold means. It means that because of something I do, they don't get to hear any audio from my side of the call. Using what you already know about SIP, media options and media packets, how do you suggest that SIP handles the issue of putting someone on hold? I'm hoping you'll come up with 2 or 3 main points. Right, now that you've had a time to think, let's find out if you're on the right track. Go ahead and make the call, answer it, and then with the call established, just for now from the caller user agent, press the hold button and see what happens. Open up the SIP logs and study both the SIP message flow and the content of the messages. When you're ready, press play, and I'll ask you some more questions. So I've got my two user agents here ready to go. I'll quickly click on the View Call Logs tab so that we can see the exchange of SIP messages, and I'll select from my drop down list the address of the other guy. I've dialed him before, and I'll click dial. I'll accept the call on the other side, and then the session is established. So now I'm going to go to the hold button and click hold. Straight away we can see that some more SIP signaling has been exchanged between these two user agents, namely that another request has been sent out, and if we look closely up here we see that it is another invite. Mapping out the call flow, we see that even after the media stream has been established and both parties are exchanging those media packets, another signaling packet, another invite, in fact a re-invite, is sent out over the network. Now I must confess that when I was first learning about CSeq and heard about these things called re-invites, I wasn't quite sure about what was going on. Was there another CSeq request that I hadn't heard of yet called the re-invite with some special new characteristics, some special new purpose? No. Absolutely not. There was and is no such new request of type re-invite. Re-invite simply refers to another invite that's sent out over the network during a call. It's spelled just the same, I-N-V-I-T-E, with no R-E at the beginning, and does pretty much exactly the same thing. Carries an invite to a call of a particular type, as determined by the media options in its payload. So to distinguish them from the original invites, they've become known as re-invites. But remember, they're pretty much exactly the same in name, format, and nature as the original invite we have at the beginning of the call. So what's the difference then between these two invites? Well, how about you take a look at your log for a moment, study the first invite, and then come and study the second invite and see if you can find the differences then. So here's my second invite, and if I scroll down there, my eye is drawn immediately to two things. One here is the CSeq value. We can see here that the CSeq number has been incremented. We'll talk more about the CSeq later in this lesson. The big thing that I'm looking for now is the content of the payload. Can you see here how the IP address for routing media packets has been set to 0000? Does that surprise you? Now think about it for a moment. What difference does this change actually make to the call? Putting someone on hold means we don't want them to hear anything or be part of the conversation. So how does changing the RTP delivery address to 0.0.0.0 achieve this goal? Actually, strictly speaking, it doesn't. Remember how the first invite carried an RTP delivery address in its original media options, saying to the downstream user agent something like, if you accept the invitation, send your media packets to this address. And remember how the downstream user agent's returning 200 OK carried his RTP delivery address in his media options, telling the upstream user agent this time where to send his media packets. Then, both having each other's addresses, the media path is established, and both sides can begin encoding and sending media packets representing the conversation. However, if the caller sends some new media options in a re-invite with the RTP delivery address of 0000, it's almost as if he's saying, actually, don't send your media packets here anymore, send them somewhere else instead, to 0000 instead of 192.168.2.10 or whatever the address was before. Now the downstream user agent isn't that silly. He knows that 0000 is not a real IP address and knows simply just not to send any packets anywhere. Notice how this signaling has had absolutely no impact on the dispatch of media packets from the caller. An almost unwritten assumption here is that as well as telling the guy downstream to stop sending media packets, the guy upstream also has to remember not to send his media packets. That's perhaps even more important when we're putting somebody on hold. So I'll just have a go at taking the call off hold myself. I'll click the hold button again and no surprises there. Another invite is sent out. This time, if we look in the payload, we see that it includes the RTP delivery address of the caller once more, meaning that the guy downstream knows where once more to send his RTP packets. Sending the re-invite with the caller's address once more in the media options results in the callee knowing once more to send media packets back to the caller at the caller's RTP address. The caller, of course, also needs to remember to start sending his media packets back as well. So we've seen here that to place the other party on hold, a re-invite is sent with the RTP delivery address of 0.0.0.0 in its media options, signaling to the other guy to stop sending his media packets. Remember though how the dispatch of this re-invite doesn't automatically stop the other guy receiving media packets. The sender must also remember to stop sending his media packets. Then to take the other party off hold so they can exchange media again, Another re-invite is sent, this time including in its payload the user's real IP address in its media options for routing once more those RTP packets. The difference between the two transactions is that the re-invite transaction does not have a 180 provisional response. Now the reason for that is obvious enough. The phone can't ring because the call is already on the call. But there's another question, perhaps a less obvious question, that's worth considering. Now think back to the discussion we had about reliable delivery of the buy request. Remember, that's a subsequent request, and how its reliable delivery is often confirmed straight away with a final response and no need for a 100 trying. Now in that context, why do you suggest is there a need for a provisional response in this transaction to this re-invite? It's all to do with the need for human intervention, just like we talked about earlier. Whenever a human is required to do something, the user agent just seems to know that, being relatively slow to process and respond, us humans need a bit more time. So, on receiving a re-invite, perhaps suggesting a change of codec quality or something like that, the user agent straight away sends back the 100 trying to satisfy the upstream timer for the re-invite. Only then does it try and alert the user to the suggested changes, possibly through a pop-up window or something like that, and waits for the user to make his choice. Now, just like we saw earlier with the 200 OK to the original invite, because the provisional response has satisfied the reliable delivery timer upstream, the human's not limited to make his decision within that limited 32-second time period, before the re-invite is cancelled. So he can take his time and make his choice, which of course triggers the dispatch of the 200 OK to the re-invite. And, just like before, responsibility, here's the mouthful, for reliable delivery of the final response to the invite always falls on the user agent server. So he sets the timer and waits for something to come back acknowledging that the response has arrived just fine. Our old friend, the ACK. Here's a question for you then. We know that at a lower level, the network level, IP packets can potentially travel over different routes between user agents or endpoints. And as such, there's always a risk that with router queues and network congestion, packets may arrive in the wrong order. Now imagine an invite request being sent out to initiate a session. And imagine then sometime later, a re-invite request is sent out to place the call on hold. But the on-hold invite is delayed somehow in the network. It's possible that just a moment later, the caller takes the call off hold, triggering the dispatch of another re-invite, which because of congestion is sent through the network over a different route. Now, as we can see here, it's possible that these two re-invites could arrive out of order. Can you see it there? Now, although this is an unlikely scenario, it is possible. And should it happen, well, what would be the effect on the call? If the off-hold request arrives before the on-hold request, and both requests were processed in that order, then the last request to be processed would of course be the on-hold invite, meaning that the call will be placed on hold and no media exchange will take place, and there'll be no later subsequent request to take the call off hold. Disastrous! The call will be on hold indefinitely. Now obviously this can't be. Fortunately, CSeq has a built-in mechanism for preventing these kinds of problems, for ensuring that even if they arrive out of order, signaling packets are at least processed in the correct order. So if an old request arrives late and out of order, then CSeq user agents know to simply ignore it in light of the most recent request that's already been processed. So in this scenario, the call would continue to be in an off-hold state, just how it should be. So, the next big question, how does a user agent know the order in which requests should arrive, and therefore the order in which they should either be processed or discarded? It's the CSeq header, or the command sequence header, that enables user agents to know the correct order for sequencing of requests. In fact, we've already talked about the CSeq header in the last lesson. Do you remember how we said the user agent increments its CSeq number with every new transaction? Except for the ACK. So, with each new re-invite, the upstream user agent client increments the CSeq number to make sure the downstream user agent knows the correct order, so that should anything arrive out of order, he knows whether to process or disregard. That reminds me, when we were talking last time about CSeq values and how they increment between transactions, when we were looking at them in the context of the invite and the buy, some of us noted that the CSeq and the buy incremented as expected, whilst others of us noted that it did not. In fact, this was one of those tasks I've asked you to think about during our discussions. Did you notice any pattern yet? Any pattern regarding when the CSeq number increments and when it doesn't? And I'm not talking about the ACK, because we know that the ACK breaks the rule anyway. If you haven't yet, how about you go back now to your user agents and experiment setting up some more calls. This time try different combinations of doing things like dial, hold, off hold, and hang up from different user agents, and study the logs to see if you can find a pattern and deduce a rule regarding when the CSeq increments and when it does not. The key regarding incrementation of the CSeq header is all related to who makes the next step. In actual fact, the rule that the CSeq header always increments between transactions does indeed hold true, regardless of what we think we've seen. Actually, there are two exceptions, one being the ACK and another we'll look at later. But let's have a look at things together. So I'm going to make a call now from the caller to the callee. I'll just open up the tabs here so we can see what's going on. I'll accept the call, and when we look in the CSeq value of the outgoing invite, we see of course that it started with an initial number of 1. I'll then place the call on hold, and I'll take a look in the re-invite, and we expect to see the CSeq has incremented as expected. There it is, CSeq 2. I'll take the call off hold, and I'll find the new invite, the re-invite, and we expect that if the rule is true, the CSeq value will be incremented. Let's take a look inside. There it is, CSeq 3. So the rule does hold true. Now, here's the key. Let me then, with the call in the connected state, move now to the downstream user agent and put the call on hold from the downstream user agent's perspective. Now here we go, on hold. We'll take a look in the invite. Doesn't matter where we take it. Let's take it in the upstream user agent. Here's the invite. My goodness me, look at this. The CSeq value does not appear to have incremented. The CSeq value is 1. And yet when I take the call off hold and look at that re-invite, we see that this time the CSeq value has incremented. Can you see what's happening now? The incrementation of the CSeq value depends on who is making the next step. Let's have a look at this in more detail now. Remember, the whole point of the CSeq header is for me to enable the other guy to process my requests in the correct order. It's one-sided, from me to him. CSeq values are endpoint independent. Now it just so happens the other guy feels the same way towards me and will do the same things to help me. But that's not the point. Now I tell him what he needs to know so that he can process my requests in the correct order. So as a user agent prepares to send out his first request, he chooses a sequence number, like 1 for example, and inserts it in the CSeq header of his request. Now the downstream user agent receives it, checks the CSeq, and notes that it's the highest number it's processed so far. In fact, the only number it's processed so far, and therefore he knows to go ahead and process the request. Sometime later, when the upstream client wants to do something else, like place the call on hold again, knowing it has to provide information so the guy downstream can process this request in the correct sequence, if something gets delayed on the way down, for example, it knows to increment the CSeq value to 2 and puts this new value in the request before sending it downstream. On receiving the request downstream, the user agent says, just like a moment ago, I haven't already processed any requests with a higher value in the CSeq, so this must be the most current. I will process it. Each time the client sends out a new request, he will for sure, unless it's one of those two exceptions, increment the CSeq value, just to make sure the guy downstream knows that this is the latest and therefore the most important request to be processed. Now when, however, the downstream user agent wants to send a request back upstream, he's not bothered at all about the upstream guy's sequence number. That's completely irrelevant now. All he's bothered about is making sure the upstream guy has sufficient information to process his requests correctly should any of them arrive out of order. So, if he wants to put the call on hold now, He chooses a starting number, like 1 for example, and inserts it in the CSeq header before sending the request out over the network. On receipt at the other side, the user agent now notes that he has not already processed any requests with a higher value, so knows it's okay to go ahead and process this one. Now, when the callee wants to take the call off hold, he knows to increment his CSeq value once again, so that when the request is received on the other side, the user agent knows that he's not, I'm repeating myself now, already processed a request with a higher sequence number, and knows that it's okay to process this request. So we see here that there are two sets of sequence numbers, both independent of each other, a caller set and a callee set. If the caller then wants to go and do something more, like end the call for example, again he'll increment his CSeq number to give sequence information to the other guy to make sure it's processed appropriately. Let's move on now to the call ID. What did you notice about the call ID in your previous calls? So I'm going to make a quick call again. So I've got some logs to look at. Let me take a look at the call ID in my first invite. Here it is. I see that it ends in 603. Let me take a look at the next message in the 100 trying. And here's the call ID. It also ends in 603. In fact, if I look at all of these messages within this same call, I notice that they all end in 603, regardless of whether I look in the caller or the callee. This begs the question, of course, when does the call ID change? And the answer is, as is quite obvious, when the call changes. These call IDs are to identify each call. If I make a new call now and accept that and hang it up, if I look at the call ID here, the call ID this time it's different, 238. In fact, let me take a look at one of the other SIP messages and I'll see that the call ID, if I can find it, is 238. Now, with this particular user agent, I can look between the different log files of the different calls. So here's my last call where we saw the call ID ended in 238. If I go to a previous call, I can take any of these messages and find that the call ID ends in 603. So whenever there's a call between user agents, every SIP message within that call has a common, unique identifier. So if a moment later there's another call, then all of the messages in that call will have another call ID to uniquely identify that call, and so on and so on. Now you might be thinking, so what? Okay, it's nice for the SIP messages in a call to feel this sense of belonging, united by that shared but unique identity. But what relevance does it really have? Why is it so important for user agents to identify messages in this way? Well, how about this scenario? Here we have a user agent that invites another to a call, and the normal exchange takes place, resulting in the session being established and media packets streaming backwards and forwards between the clients. How about then sometime later, when the call is still established, another invite comes in? Now, having zoomed in on the slide somewhat and hidden visually the source of the invite, well, you tell me. Is the request a re-invite from user agent 2, a subsequent request in the same SIP session? Or is it a completely new invite from another user agent, hoping to set up another call? Well, the fact is, we just can't tell. How about now? Can you tell if I zoom out a bit? Indeed we can. A quick glance at the call ID and we know straight away that this request does not belong to this session or this call. And actually, that's exactly what the user agent does. It takes a quick glance at the call ID to know straight away if the request should be handled in the context of an existing call or handled as an initial invite for another call. I'll tell you when call IDs really become important, and that's when we go beyond the peer-to-peer call, which, incidentally, is the vast majority of our calls. Now, I know we haven't talked much about SIP servers yet. We'll get into them in more detail in the next lesson. But imagine a SIP server sitting between the two endpoint user agents, acting as a proxy to forward requests and responses up and downstream. Well, in this simple scenario, okay, the call IDs don't make a lot of difference. Here the proxy only has one call to handle. But of course it's never that simple. it's likely that there'll be many calls that need to be set up, each with its own set of requests and responses. To make things even more realistic, it's much more likely that requests and responses from different calls will be arriving at the proxy intermingled and in unpredictable sequences. So how then does the proxy keep track of things and know how to correlate requests and responses of the same call? Of course, it's with the call ID. The call ID becomes invaluable in this situation. SIP servers may be processing thousands of SIP messages from thousands of user agents every second. It uses the call ID to correlate and manage them. So to summarize, and perhaps to recap, the call ID changes with every new call. I guess that's why it's called the call ID, in that it just identifies each call uniquely. Looking at its syntax, you'll notice that the call ID has two elements that together provide this unique global identification. It begins with what should be a unique random string, but just in case the string's not random enough, it also includes the caller's hostname or IP address as well. Now note, however, that the IP address in the call ID is never to be used for any routing purposes. It's just that extra step to ensure uniqueness. Let's take another look now at SIP responses. I'd like to skip redirection until the next lesson and focus now on the 400 type error responses. As it says, the 400 type response is a client error response. In fact, you'll notice that there are other types of error responses too, the server error and the global failure responses. More on these in the next lesson as well. Now, a 400 client error response is a final response that reports that a session cannot be established because of some reason at the downstream user agent. Now, I'm not quite sure about the phrase error in this family name. To illustrate my point, consider these two responses. Sorry, I'm already busy on another call, and no thanks, I don't want to talk to you. Now, they're both definitely 400 client error responses, but I'm not sure that I could argue strongly that they are error situations. To me, they're more like rejection responses, where the user has consciously decided not to take the call, rather than something having gone wrong or an error having occurred. Listen, but that's just my thoughts. The spec says they're error responses, so error responses they are. Now, talking of the spec, RFC 3261 defines a whole bunch of 400 client error responses. So how about you click here for the RFC and scroll down to the table of contents on page 5 and 6, where it lists the client error response types. Then look for the one you suggest will be sent back if someone can't take the call because they're already on a call. The 400 type response sent back to say that you can't take a call because you're already busy on another is the 486 busy here response. That's a good name, busy here, because I'm busy here. How about you do some practical now and try and generate a 486 busy here response of your own. Play around with your user agents and do whatever it takes to get one of them to respond to the other with this 486 busy here response. Give it some thought and hopefully you'll figure out what to do. Just in case you need it, I'll be giving you a clue as to what you need to do when you press play. Here's the clue. You'll need another user agent, of course. So either unpack the zip that you've downloaded in lesson 1 again, or even easier, just cut and paste one of your existing user agent folders to give you the third user agent and go inside to run the executable and bring the user agent up. Remember to configure it with its own UDP port. I usually use port 3003, but you can choose anything you like that's free. So I've got my 3 user agents on the screen now. I'll make a call from one to the other to set up that first call. I'll accept it. We've got the connection made between these two guys. I'll come to my third user agent and click dial. And it's alerting, but I'm not going to take it because I'm busy. And we get back a 486 busy here. Okay, cool. Okay, great. Now that we've generated a 486 busy here client error response, how about looking back at the RFC for the other response we posed earlier? What's the response sent, do you suggest, for reporting to the guy upstream that you just simply don't want to talk to him, that you're rejecting his invite? Maybe that wasn't as straightforward as you might have first imagined. Let's see, could it be the 403 forbidden? Well, the server understood the request but is refusing to fulfill it. authorization will not help and the request should not be repeated, blah, blah, blah. No, that's nothing to do with rejecting the call simply because I don't want to speak to the guy. Let's get rid of that one. How about the 406 not acceptable? It says the resource identified by the request is only capable of generating response entities that have content characteristics, blah, blah, blah. No, that's nothing to do with rejecting the invite. So, if it's not the 403 and it's not the 406, then what can it be? I'll tell you what, how about you simply set up a call of your own, reject it, and find out for yourself what the user agent does to reject the invitation. Yes, I was quite surprised about that too. The response that rejects an invitation to talk is the same 486 we saw a moment ago to tell the other guy we can't accept his invitation because we were busy. The RFC says how a 486 is sent back if the caller is not just able to take the call, but is not willing to take the call. Well, by now you've dipped into the RFC a number of times and have had a glance over the different types of 400 response. Now, we're not going to discuss them all in detail, we just don't have time. But remember, the important thing to keep in mind is the nature and characteristics of the family. Anything that begins with a 4 is a client error, meaning that the intention of the preceding request has not been successful because of some reason decided by the downstream user agent. Now, two of my favourite 400s are the 404 not found, we'll cover that one in the next lesson, and the 486 request terminated. We'll do that one shortly. Okay, probably time now to review some more key terms. Press play when you come up with your definitions and compare them to mine. So what about changing our minds about something we've started? How about the scenario where Jim wants to call Bob? The only thing is that Bob is down the garden, occupied with something far more interesting than taking a call from Jim. Unawares, Jim dials and his invite is dispatched, which in turn of course triggers the usual 100 try and 180 ringing from Bob's user agent. Bob, however, is far from the phone and, even if he could hear it ringing, would probably ignore it anyway. Now meanwhile the seconds pass away and Jim becomes increasingly impatient, until after some time he decides enough is enough and he can't wait any longer. So, knowing what you know about CSeq, how do you suggest CSeq caters for this scenario? You do know the answer. We're using something we've seen before, albeit now in a slightly different context. The answer is simple. CSeq allows us to cancel previous requests. You're getting quite a bit of exposure to CSeq call flow now. So how about you take a scrap piece of paper and a pen and sketch out or predict the remainder of the call flow in this simple cancellation scenario. I've started things off for you. Can you finish the complete exchange of messages to bring this cancelled call to a proper conclusion? Here's a clue. There should be a total of 7 messages in the call flow map. Now that you've made your prediction, go ahead and set up another call and then cancel it. Then look at your user agent log and check your predicted call flow with the actual call flow. Interesting. We've already seen the cancel request back in the last lesson, but that was in the context of a user agent automatically sending a cancel request after failing to get back a response. Its purpose then was to say something like, hey, I'm not sure if you even got it, but in case you did, can you cancel any processing associated with that request I sent you a moment ago? The cancel then was sent for purposes of politeness. Remember how CSeq, being a polite protocol, can't bear the thought of someone else not knowing what's going on. This time though, things are somewhat different. Rather than the cancel being sent automatically following unreliable delivery, this time we choose to send the cancel because we've chosen not to continue with the intention of our original request. Other than that, they're the same. They have the same effect, saying to the guy on the other side something like, hey, I know you got it this time because I got back your 100 trying, but can you please, and here's the key thing, cancel any processing associated with my previous request. I've changed my mind and don't want to pursue that one anymore. Here's a thought. We know that CSeq requests are not guaranteed to arrive in the correct sequence. So what about that rather obscure situation where in a CSeq session 2 requests are received in very close succession, followed shortly by a cancel. How does the downstream user agent know which request the cancel relates to? How does it know which request to cancel? Now take a look at your user agent log for your last cancelled call and see if you can find any clues that relate the cancel request to a specific preceding request. Now I know you'll only have one preceding request in your log, but nevertheless, see if you can find a link. The thing that ties a cancel to a specific request is, believe it or not, the CSeq header. Not the CSeq's method type, but the CSeq number. Note how the CSeq number in the cancel is the same as the CSeq number in the invite being cancelled. That's the key. As simple as that. So if we have the rare, rather obscure situation where within a SIP session we have multiple requests that arrive in close succession, with a cancel arriving a moment later, the request to be cancelled is the one with the same CSeq number as that found in the cancel request. But hang on a moment, doesn't this break one of those rules we talked about earlier? So what is that rule that we're talking about? It's the one about the transaction and how between transactions the CSeq header is incremented. Well, we've talked already about how an endpoint increments the CSeq number in its successive requests, primarily to make sure the guy on the other side knows which one is the latest and therefore which to either process or to discard. Now that's why some say that the CSeq number is a transaction identifier. But this is not really a true indicator of a transaction identity. As we see in this scenario, the cancel request is a new transaction in its own right, and yet the CSeq number is not incremented. It can't be. After all, it's the key that ties the cancel to the request that's to be cancelled. So now we have those two exceptions when a user agent will not increment the CSeq number, the cancel and the ACK. Now what about dealing with uncertainties back upstream at the user agent client? Hopefully on your call flow map you'll have predicted there'll be a 200 OK after the cancel request. But here's a potential area for confusion. Can you spot it? How might upstream user agents here get confused regarding receipt of the 200 OK? If things weren't so well defined by the spec, the upstream user agent could get confused here, wondering if the 200 OK was the 200 to the invite or to the cancel. So how does the upstream user agent know how to differentiate between the two? You might want to set up a couple more SIP calls, some that complete successfully and others that you cancel. Then take a look in your logs at the respective 200s and see if you can spot the key. So in the scenario where after a request like an invite is sent out, closely followed by a cancel, which in turn is closely followed by a 200 OK, the key used by the upstream client to determine if it's the 200 OK to the invite or the 200 OK to the cancel is once again the CSeq. This time, however, it's not the CSeq number, but the CSeq method. Remember how the user agent client always includes in the CSeq header the name of the request or the transaction type to which it belongs, CSeq1 invite in the invite, etc. Remember too how the CSeq number in the cancel doesn't change either? Well, those same CSeq headers are copied directly into the responses, meaning that straight away, with a quick glance at the CSeq header in the returning response, a user agent client can directly correlate each response to the right request. So the 200 OK that comes back in our cancellation call flow is the 200 to the cancel, confirming reliable delivery of the cancel request. We could say that the 200 to the cancel concludes the cancel transaction. But does it conclude the call? Is that it as far as this cancellation scenario is concerned? Well, I mentioned a moment ago that there are 7 messages in this call flow, and so far, including the 200 OK to the cancel, we only have 5. The cancel transaction may have been concluded, but the invite transaction most certainly has not. The 6th message in this scenario is a response to the invite, a response to conclude the invite transaction. Which response though? Take a look again at the RFC and scan through the response types until you find one which seems to fit the purpose. I'll give you a clue. It's a response type that belongs to one of the three families we've already discussed. So think about if it best suits the 100 type family, the 200 or the 400 type of response. Then go straight to that part of the RFC and see if you can find a response that fits. It's the 487 request terminated that, after the cancel, concludes the invite transaction. The 487 is the final response to the invite. Now here's a revision question for you. Who has responsibility for reliable delivery of the final response to the invite? And how does it work? Of course, it's just like the success scenarios we've looked at earlier. Even with a non-success final response, it's the downstream user agent server who always has responsibility for reliable delivery of the final response to the invite. The downstream user agent sets the timer and waits for something to come back. That something being the ACK. Just like before, when the ACK arrives back downstream, it's as if the user agent heaves a big sigh of relief, content that its final response to the invite, albeit an error response, has been delivered reliably. Now remember, always with an invite, even if we have an error response and an unsuccessful outcome, we still have that three-way handshake. The invite, the final response, and the ACK. So, there we go, the complete call flow for our cancelled call scenario. How does it compare to the call flow that you predicted? Phew, we've covered quite a lot in this session. There's just one more topic I'd like to cover before we finish. I'd like to introduce another SIP request. I'd like to talk about the options request. Now, I think the options request must be the least frequently used out of the 6 request types. In my experience, I've used and seen used invites, ACKs, buys and cancels almost every day. I certainly can't say the same for the options request. I also think that its name doesn't really reflect the purpose quite so well as the other requests. Now, we all know what the word options means. It means a set of choices. And we all know that a request is something sent out to initiate some process or to give an instruction. So the natural combination might lead us to think that in sending an options request, we hope to find out what our options are for a communication. We're sending an instruction to find out what choices we have to choose from. Now, although this definition is kind of true, I think to better understand the options request, we need to look at it from a slightly different perspective. In fact, I wonder if the RFC team felt the same way about the options request as the protocol evolved, in that the section title of the options request now uses the word capabilities. Capabilities refers to things like what can a user agent do and what codecs or extensions does it support. The options request is all about finding the capabilities of the other party. It reminds me a little of how some time ago we prepared for a big family trip. Now, in planning for the holiday, before we actually made the trip, I contacted hotels along the way to check if they could accommodate my needs. Did they have the rooms available? Could I use my loyalty points? Did they serve food, etc., etc.? Now, I guess we could say that I contacted them to check their capabilities. As they responded with their lists of capabilities, I knew what my options were and I could make my choices. So, in the SIP world, if we want to find out the capabilities of the other guy, I can send him an options request. Now, when you look at the content of this options request, there's nothing new there. The to and the from have the same purpose they have in all other SIP requests, as does the via, the contact, the call ID, and so on. The only difference really is the method type, being now options. That one word, however, makes all the difference, signifying to the recipient that someone wants to find out what they can do, what they support. Now, thinking about the call flow for a moment, there might or might not be a provisional response depending on the round trip time, but there most certainly will be a final response. So what kind of response do you suggest will be used if the user agent server is happy to give back his capabilities? And which type of response do you suggest he will use if he does not wish to provide his capabilities. If the user agent is happy to provide his capabilities, he'll send back a 200 OK, a success response that now includes additional headers that describe his capabilities. The allow header contains a list of all the types of requests supported by the user agent. We can see from this example that the user agent knows about almost all of the standard SIP requests. In fact, the only one it doesn't know about is the register request. Now, we haven't talked about the register request yet, but after we do in the next lesson, it'll be clear why this user agent doesn't support it. But remember though, it might not be a user agent that we're querying for capabilities. It might be a server. And we might just want to find out if the server can handle registrations before going to the effort of creating and sending a register request. The accept headers describe different things that are acceptable to the user agent, types of payload, languages, etc. And the supported header provides a list of any SIP extensions the user agent supports. We'll talk more about SIP extensions in the last lesson of this series. But for now, think for a moment about instant messaging. Now, that's not something described by a pure SIP, but is something we can do over SIP, so long as, of course, we all know how to do it in the same way. One last thing about an options request. An options can be sent at any time, maybe before an invite is sent, perhaps to see if it's actually worth sending the invite, or maybe during an existing session, perhaps just like I mentioned a moment ago, where one party wants to find out if the other guy supports something like instant messaging or whiteboarding or something. So there's another request type to add to your list, the options request used to seek the capabilities of another user agent or server. There's just one more type of SIP request left to cover, and that's the register request, which we'll deal with in the next lesson. So in summary, we began this lesson by looking at how to change the nature of a call without having to hang up and redial. For example, how to put the call on and off hold. We achieved this by sending another invite, a re-invite, this one having a different set of media options than the first invite. We then spent some time looking at the network issue of how, because of queues and congestion, it's possible for packets to arrive out of sequence. Remember what would happen if the on-hold invite arrived out of sequence after the off-hold invite? Of course, the call would remain on hold. It's the responsibility of the guy sending his request to make sure the other guy knows the correct sequence or order for processing these requests. And to do this, he uses the CSeq counter, incrementing it each time a new request is sent out. Both user agents keep their own counters. They increment them independently. They're not related in any way. Oh, here's one thing I didn't tell you earlier about the initial CSeq number. There is no rule that says it always has to begin with 1. Sometimes you might find huge 8-digit numbers in the CSeq header. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean there have been huge numbers of transactions in the call. It might just be that they chose a big number for the first CSeq value. We talked about how all SIP messages within a call are bound together or related by a common but unique identity, the call ID, a random string made even more unique by the inclusion of the caller's IP address or hostname. The call ID is particularly useful at the SIP proxy, where potentially thousands of requests and responses arrive for processing every second, requests and responses that first need to be put in the context of the call to which they belong. The SIP server uses the call ID for this purpose. Next, we discussed a second family of final responses, the 400 type client error responses. Now, that's a non-success response which conveys the fact that the invite has not been accepted. Although there are two other non-success response families, the 500s and 600s, the thing which differentiates the 400 family is that the reason for the refusal is generated by, decided by, the endpoint user agent, rather than by some proxy or gateway. We looked at how the 486 is used for both rejecting because of being busy and just plain not wanting to talk to the guy. And also we looked at the 487, request terminated, following a cancel invite. Talking of which, that was our next topic, how to change our minds about a request that we've issued but that has not yet been concluded. How, if we want to, we can send a cancel request. The cancel effectively tells the other guy to stop processing the request and to release any associated resources. Remember how in the cancel transaction, the CSeq does not increment. After all, it's the matching CSeq numbers that tell the guy downstream which request or which transaction to cancel. Remember too that although the returning 200 OK completes the cancel transaction, the invite transaction still needs a final response of its own. Following a cancel, that would always be the 487 request terminated, which, like all final responses to an invite, is answered in turn with an ACK. Whenever we see the invite, we always expect to see that three-way handshake. The invite, the final response to the invite, and the ACK. Finally, we looked at how CSeq lets us find out the capabilities of other CSeq devices using the options request. Through it, we can find out what they support, what they can do. Things like supported request and header types, codecs, content types, CSeq extensions, and so forth. Cool. Time now for the final review in this lesson. Let's see how much of this, if any, has made sense to you. In the next lesson, we'll be looking at CSeq servers and services available through CSeq. Here's where all our groundwork of the first 3 lessons come together in a real-world context. You see, we're not typically going to be using CSeq because it offers us simple peer-to-peer calls. Rather, we're going to be using CSeq because of how conducive it is to enabling services, many of which will be hosted on some kind of CSeq server. Then in the final lesson, we'll discuss how and why CSeq has become so prominent in communications, including a look at how, because CSeq facilitates innovation so well, it's been extended to provide services such as instant messaging, presence, and conferencing. Can't wait!